Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this conversation hosted by the Center on Faith and Justice, titled Christianity, Misogyny, and the Roots of Resilience. It's part of our Women in Leadership programming during Women's History Month. I'm Dr. Kathleen Bonnette, and I'm delighted to be serving as moderator for today's discussion. If I'm being honest, in the aftermath of the 2024 US presidential election, in which a movement made up primarily of Christians, trafficked heavily in racism, misogyny, and xenophobia, as well as an utter disregard for the health of our planet, I've been wrestling with my place in the church. A good tree bears good fruit, Jesus tells us. So what does it mean when Christian moral formation has borne the fruit of racism, misogyny, and exploitation? At the same time, there are those whose faith moves us to stand against those evils, and this resistance brings the good fruit of justice and resilience. Christianity is enriched by the resilience of those who maintain a resolute commitment to affirming the equal dignity of all through the care and compassion at the heart of the Gospels, as women have since the beginning, despite institutional and cultural efforts to silence them. So this afternoon, we'll be grappling with the misogyny that infects our churches, men and women alike, consciously and unconsciously, and we'll explore what we can learn from women who persist in the faith despite it. We'll think through why misogyny is not only a women's issue, but something that holds deleterious consequences for our whole church body, and why Christian misogyny in particular is not only a church issue, but one with vast political implications. We're honored to explore these questions today with this incredible panel. Jeanné Lewis serves as CEO at Faith in Public Life. She is a nonprofit executive, faith-based organizer, and authority on creating empowered communities. She's dedicated her community to building bridges, closing equity gaps, and creating policies that lead to strong, thriving, and self-determined cities. Jeanné is a member of the DC Working Families Party, St. Augustine Catholic Parish, and Songrise, a women's social justice a cappella group. Dr. Kristin Du Mez is a New York Times bestselling author and professor of history at Calvin University. She's currently a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Notre Dame. She holds a PhD from Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. Her most recent book is Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. We'll be talking a little bit more about that. Reverend Terry Hord Owens is the General Minister and President of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. She's the first person of color and second woman to lead the denomination, and the first woman of African descent to lead a mainline denomination. Reverend Hord Owens earned her bachelor's degree from Harvard University and her MDiv from the University of Chicago Divinity School, where she subsequently served as Dean of Students for 12 years. And finally, Reverend Dr. Gabby Cudjoe Wilkes is one of the co-founding co-lead pastors of the Double Love Experience Church in Brooklyn, New York, along with her husband. They are also the co-authors of Psalms for Black Lives, Reflections for the Work of Liberation. Pastor Gabby is a public theologian with over 15 years of experience working at the intersection of faith, culture, leadership, and strategy, and she is the current vice president of the Yale University Divinity School Alumni Board. As we move through this conversation, we invite you to submit questions using the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We'll save time to get to as many as we can. We'd love to include you in this conversation as well. So we have a lot to discuss. Let's jump in. I want to begin by inviting each of our panelists to share why you are here today. Given all that is going on in our world and our lives, all that you could devote your time and energy to, what is it that drew you to this conversation? And Kristin, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And, it was an easy yes. Yeah, yes, there's a lot going on. But first of all, I find myself always saying yes to anything that Georgetown's Center for Faith or Center on Faith and Justice puts on. And, this topic in particular right now, I think we are sensing a need to find one another, to connect with one another, to listen to each other, and to hold together during this time. And particularly as people of faith and as women of faith from diverse backgrounds and from diverse spaces, we need to hold together now and connect not just with those in this on camera, but with all of those joining us today, just holding together.
Thank you. Jeanné, how about you?
Hello, everyone. It's a joy to be here. Thanks, Kathleen, for bringing us all together. For me, it was also an easy yes. I think this is a critical time for us. And the main motivation for me is my grandmother. My grandmother, Hilda Donald, was born in the 1920s in rural Louisiana, and she was a fierce minister, pastor, and just compassionate human being. And I have been thinking about her daily over the last year as our country has been sliding into authoritarianism. And so one of the lessons of the many that my grandmother taught me is the importance of accepting and acting on our anointing. And as a lay Catholic, I've been thinking a lot about the importance of lay women, especially understanding our power and our anointing through baptism and our responsibility in our churches and in this larger political moment. With my grandmother, she was a cradle Catholic, as am I, but she was called to start a church when she was in her mid-50s, and she was not able to do that through the Catholic Church. And I'll share more about her later in our conversation, but she decided to follow God's call, left the Catholic Church, and established a robust ministry throughout Louisiana. And growing up with her, I learned what it means to be a person of faith and follow your calling, what it means to act on a belief of human dignity and compassion for all human beings, as she ministered often to disabled adults, and to lead with discernment and resilience by taking risks and persevering even when people discouraged you. So the other reason I'm here today is because when I look at our larger political environment, I see that we are in a cultural debate around who has authority in our nation, in our churches, and in our homes. And particularly that debate is often centered around gender. So the church has debated theology around this question and around gender for centuries, millennia, really. And one of the flashpoints around this, in addition to gender, is around the laity and the clergy and where authority lies, especially as it relates to women and femmes. So I think it's really important to talk about clericalism. So not necessarily clerics, but the promotion of clergy as a class, clericalism, and how that echoes the authoritarianism we're seeing in our larger political environment. So I think this topic is really timely. And as a layperson, I hope that I'm able to add a unique perspective to the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so excited to dig into some of that with you in a minute. Pastor Gabby, how about you?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you. I would also say I really appreciate the work that this center does. I've seen you all tackle really hard conversations and not shy away from how hard these conversations are, because many of the topics are embodied topics. And I really appreciate the courage of this center. I appreciate you all's leadership, and have had the opportunity to do things with you all before. And I'm just like, whenever you all call, yeah, I'm there. I would say in particular to today's topic, I'm really drawn to this, the latter half of the definition, the roots of resilience. I think it's really important in a moment like this to trace the history of resilience in our nation. We have had to be resilient, different people groups for different reasons for a very long time. And I think that we're in a moment now that calls to us to tap into the knowing of generations before us, to find that resilience they had and decide what it looks like in 2025. I'm in a lot of communities where folks will say, we've been here before, we'll be all right. And I push back. We haven't been in this moment before, because we hadn't had these wins when we were in this moment, in that moment. And so what makes this moment tremendously difficult for me and those that I serve is that we're back fighting battles we already won. It's a very different kind of necessary resilience than the underdogs who haven't won yet, but who are fighting with everything they have to win. And so while I honor the experiences we've had, this is a different moment. It's a moment where the rug is pulled from under you. It's a moment where at least the few things you thought were secure were going to stay there and you could build on, those things fell too. And so tracing the roots of resilience, what does resiliency look like reborn in 2025, but building on the resilience for the past 400 plus years in this nation, is what really drew me to, oh, they're ready to have another courageous conversation. And I'm just excited to be present and to add my voice to this incredible group of women.
Thank you so much. And that the roots of resilience. I'm so excited to hear your reflections on that. Reverend Terry, why are you here?
Well, I'm here in large part, as the others have stated, because an invitation from the Center on Faith and Justice is always something that I will pay attention to and accept it as much as I can. I've been in the room with all of these women at other events and grateful to be able to continue the conversation, and grateful always when I can be in a place where there's just fine humanity and brilliance at work. And I love being able to not only be among, but celebrate the brilliance of women who are leading in this space. I'm old enough to say that I'm a child of that movement and remember my parents and grandparents fighting for the things that are now slowly but surely being dismantled. Women in my ancestral line who, like Jeanné, weren't able to lead in the ways that they were clearly gifted to lead, simply not allowed to lead, and responsible and very cognizant of the responsibility that I have to bear witness to that legacy, but also the responsibility that I have to remind people that our ancestors thought that they had secured it for us. They thought that the work that they had done would mean that we would be handing off something very different. And I'm just mindful of the fact that if I'm not vocal, if I'm not active, if I'm not encouraging other people to be active, both on issues of gender as well as race, issues of freedom of religion in this country, so many ways in which I must be vocal and active so that my 2-year-old grandson, Zachary, will be able to live in a world that perhaps I can reimagine for him that doesn't look like the one in prayerfully at 2, he won't remember any of this. This will be history that he will read, and hopefully he will read that his Gigi was there taking a stand and trying to make a difference. So I think anytime we have an opportunity, we have to be mindful of those who've gone before. How dare I stand back when people bled, literally bled and died, so that I could have the opportunities that I have. And if I don't perhaps bleed, hopefully not die, but if I don't do a little work on my own, there will be others who will not have what we are able to enjoy, even in some measure. I think we'll talk about the fact that we certainly have not yet overcome, even given the benefits that we enjoy. We're certainly not there yet, but we risk it all slipping away if we're not vigilant.
Thank you so much. That's powerful. Kristin, I want to turn to you to kind of set the framing for this conversation. In your book, Jesus and John Wayne, you've traced the ways Christians have given up gospel values for the sake of power, political power, and that this actually depends primarily on the disempowerment of women. And so I'd love for you to just kind of take us through a little bit of that history. What is standing out to you in this moment?
Yeah, when I set off to write Jesus and John Wayne, or actually long before that, when I just started paying attention to how white evangelicals were talking about manhood, it was jarring. It was jarring because it seemed so unbiblical. And what I saw is that their models for, quote unquote, Christian manhood were not actually drawn from the scriptures. They were not drawn from Christ. They were looking to Hollywood movies and to mythical warriors, to Mel Gibson's William Wallace, and cowboys, and John Wayne, and all of these other figures that may or may not have their merits, but they're not biblical models. And then I started asking, where is this coming from, and what is this doing? And that led to what eventually became Jesus and John Wayne. And so I had been doing that research for off and on for more than a decade before I decided to go ahead and write the book. And what I realized early on in that research is, one, this wasn't biblical. And two, I came to see how frequently white evangelicals, right, that's kind of my area of study, how frequently they were talking about authority and submission, right? So power, and then submitting yourselves to the powers, kind of that God had allegedly ordained. So women to men, men to their spiritual leaders, this whole kind of, almost pyramid scheme of power. And so that rather than obeying God, you had to obey the person with authority over you. And you could just see how this was so ripe for manipulation. And I could also see, having written a first book on Christian feminism, and having had the voices of Christian women and Christian theologians from decades earlier in my head, I knew that they had also identified this tendency within patriarchal traditions to misunderstand the heart of the gospel. That Jesus did not come to claim power over others. Jesus came to divest himself of power. And then to be a Christian is to follow Christ in that way. And that is what was so revolutionary about Christianity from its very earliest days. And it is hard to do that, right? We are not wired to say, here, take my power. Or, I want to suffer, or I want to be a servant. And so that's uncomfortable. So what we see throughout Christian history is people just twisting that. People with power using Christianity as the basis for maintaining that power and for claiming even more power, for consolidating that power. And that was, in fact, the pattern that I saw historically in the last several decades of conservative white evangelicalism. So men claiming power over women, and white Christians claiming their particular understanding of Christianity in this hierarchical way, imposing that on others and claiming that that was Christianity writ large, right? Centering themselves and this, arguably erroneous understanding of Christianity. And I saw how that had been how that had taken hold. It had taken hold in a variety of different ways. It had taken hold because it was extremely well funded. It's usually easy to get money from people who are very powerful when you have theologies that condone that power. I saw how there was an entire media ecosystem built to reinforce that. I saw how there were mechanisms of control within churches, within parachurch organizations, within this entire world. And I saw the clear political ramifications of this ideology. And so that's what I wrote into that book that came out in 2020. And I have watched with growing horror at how that is bearing itself out today. How we are living in a moment where the ends justifies the means, where it is, Christianity is being warped and twisted into this, defense of power, coercion, justification for violence and for cruelty. And, I think that this is a moment when people of faith need to speak loudly and clearly, whatever the cost.
Thank you so much for that. I think identifying those connections between the patriarchal frameworks that sort of impose or help us justify the imposition of power as coercion or authoritarianism with then political or Christian political engagement that seeks to impose those structures politically as well, right? Because it's all tied together. That's so important. Thank you for highlighting that. And Jeanné, I actually want to come to you on the same topic. to pick up on this. We're both lay Catholic women participating in a church that continues to be hierarchical and patriarchal, where women's voices have been excluded from the real decision making and told that when we question some of those decisions, we are going against the Holy Spirit who is guiding the church. It's a hard place to be because, of course, we also affirm that the Holy Spirit is guiding the church, right? And so if Catholic voices have been suppressed or silenced, though, how can we have the fullness of truth in that? And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this dynamic and what the experience of participating in this faith has taught you about power, both within the church and its hierarchical and patriarchal structures, and also as it is or should be pursued by Christians in political life.
Thank you. I love this question about power. I love engaging people of faith, particularly Christians, to talk about power. And I'd love to build on something that Kristin was saying, because I agree wholeheartedly that as we've seen the rise of white Christian nationalism and this distortion of Christianity, there's been an assertion of authority. I disagree that, and again, I'm probably the only one without the level of research that you all have. But from my own formation, I disagree that Jesus came to divest himself of power. I think Jesus came to demonstrate and to pull us into our collective empowerment. So as Jesus was ascending, he was saying that you will do what I have done and even greater things. And as an African-American woman in this country, it's particularly important to hold that tension, because I think the larger narrative of authoritarianism and of the United States of America is to tell me and to tell other marginalized people that we should subjugate ourselves in order to be a good Christian. We should subjugate ourselves in order to be a good citizen. We should subjugate ourselves in order to be a good wife, in order to be a good mother, et cetera, and so forth. And so as I have learned about the expansion of our theologies, and even within the Catholic Church, my own formation, my own catechism, my own theology, it has become very evident to me that Christ repeatedly was calling people into their own empowerment. What is it that you want? I want to be healed. What is it that you want to do? Do you have faith? If you have faith, then this will happen. All of these phrases, all of this dialogue is about Christ calling people into our own empowerment and reminding us that through faith, we actually can move into a place of more empowerment. So that leads to the question in terms of how I, as a layperson in a hierarchical church, navigate this tension. I listen quite a bit to Father Richard Rohr, and I really appreciate his exploration of contemplation and Christian mysticism and the opportunity through our spiritual discipline to hold paradox. I had to do a lot of discernment, again, as a cradle Catholic, early on in my adulthood, as I considered multiple times leaving the Catholic Church, why I might stay. And so that's a much longer story that we don't have time for. But what became very clear to me is that I am a worshiper of Jesus. I am not a worshiper of the Roman Catholic Church. It also became very, very clear to me that all of our religious institutions that's within Christianity and also outside of Christianity are flawed because we have created them as flawed human beings. And so there's a paradox between how the presence of a perfect living God can be present inside of a flawed institution. And I became very clear that if I were to run to another institution, I would be encountering other flaws or maybe the same flaws, and I would have to wrestle with the same spiritual questions. And so that is spiritually how I navigate this. I mentioned my grandmother earlier, and my grandmother followed her calling in a different way. But I also want to point out that the danger, the impact of misogyny in the church, of denying the full potential of the anointing of lay women in the church, is that the church loses out. So the Catholic Church lost out on a powerful, effective pastor, missionary, and organizer because it could not find a way to allow her to minister in the way that she felt she was called to do by God. And the church really needs to wrestle with that. And by that, I mean the bishops need to wrestle with that, because we are the church, the people are the church. But the bishops, who I believe really have allied themselves with a clericalism, with an elevation and a false hierarchy of the authority of male clerics over all other baptized Christians, which is not theologically sound, at least the way that I was taught by the Catholic Church in my catechism. So through that allyship with clericalism, it has condemned the church from losing out on the full possibility of the anointing of women and femmes within the church. So lastly, I'll just say that spreading the gospel was a political act. We see that from the very beginning. And so as we contemplate our current political moment and what is the responsibility of Christians, we are called and mandated to use the spiritual gifts we've received through baptism for the common good in society. And we have a legacy from the very beginning of Christ's ministry on earth to demonstrate that that includes doing it in a way that engages the political sphere. And so I don't think there's a question or a debate about what we're called to do in this moment. And as women, we have models from the very beginning, again, in Mary Magdalene, that women are also called to do this equally and as vocally.
Thank you so much. That was so rich. I think what I'm hearing from both you and Kristin is this idea of Christ coming to challenge and subvert the empirical, the dominance of empire, right? The power that comes with empire, and to instead infuse and initiate a sense of power that comes from community and from engagement and from flourishing. And I think that's a really beautiful connection to make, especially as we're seeing it distorted today, as both of you have noted so beautifully. I also want to just highlight that notion of holding paradox, because I think as we're talking about what can be learned, what insights do we have from engaging in ways that we need to be resilient? What are the insights that come to us? And I think holding paradox is one that could be really, really helpful in today's polarized world, right? How do we sit with these tensions and really wrestle with them? So thank you for that. Pastor Gabby, I want to turn to you for a moment. You are the co-pastor of a church. You're a thought leader and a scholar. I just want to ask broadly, how have you experienced authority and power within those spaces, positively or negatively? And what have you learned?
Oh, that's a big question. Okay. I'll do my best to share without taking too much time on that question. I will say that my experience as a spiritual leader living in New York has been mostly positive. I have been mostly well received by folks. They often don't give it a second thought that I'm a pastor. I've been welcomed by clergy comrades within my borough and beyond. That's all been great and well and fine and good. I live in New York City. I was raised in Texas. My mother is a retired minister and my sister is a minister. My mother's a baby boomer. My sister's a Gen Xer. I'm a millennial. I saw a very different experience for the two of them in Dallas, Texas. And so I would first say that I'm very aware of my capacity and my ability to do what I do, and it feels very connected to my geographic location. It is not to say that New York gets it right all the time. It is to say that I'm differently aware of my personhood as a woman in New York than I am when I go as south as DC and beyond. So I want to just name kind of some geographical privilege that I have. I'm also married to a minister who was a minister before I received my call to ministry. So people knew us as a couple first, knew him as a minister. And then later in our marriage, I received my own individual call to ministry. And I found it difficult for folks who knew me prior to my call to make the adjustment. I think that is very much connected to my gender because I've seen folks make adjustments faster for men. And so one of the stories that I tell is I had joined the staff of really a mega church in New York as a young adult pastor. I was 2 years into my call and I decided to go to divinity school. And I was there my first semester of divinity school, maybe the first week. And I was a part of the Yale Black Seminarians, which are the Black student group. And one of my Black male classmates asked me what I wanted to do after seminary. And, you know, it should be a pretty innocent question for some, but I was already working in my field as a young adult pastor at a congregation that, by all accounts, by all of my classmates, is one they would have applied to work at after graduating if they could. And I'm sitting here as a divinity school student, first year MDiv, not a Master of Arts, but a Master of Divinity, right? If I were male, right, the question would have never been, what do you want to do after seminary? This is from a classmate, mind you, a peer, a Black male peer. The question would have been, oh, Doc, you trying to pastor? Where you trying to go? You already did it. It would have been a completely different conversation, right? And so I kind of checked him very early. And I was like, I'm going to be doing exactly what I'm doing right now, but with a degree. Because I'm already in the field, right? And it was very much like, it was one of the first couple of weeks of school, and it really kind of helped that community understand how to deal with me because I showed up in a very unapologetic way. But for me, that's the best example I can give of how misogyny shows up in my particular personhood. It doesn't really show up overtly, thank God, in my experience. It shows up in these microaggressions. It shows up in whatever my accolades or titles or experiences are. They're never quite enough for folks to give default full authority and submission. And, you know, even though there might be a conversation about what authority is appropriate, I do believe that the authority of a senior pastoral leader in a congregation matters, is significant, and is different. And that is something that as a woman, I have to fight for in ways that my male colleagues receive, even if they're not in senior leadership, even if they haven't preached one sermon. And so I will say to you, you know, I lead a fellowship at Union Theological Seminary. It's one that we launched a year and a half ago. I'm very proud of it. And we're going into our second round. And even in that space, as wonderful as my colleagues are, even in that space, I have to make it really clear that I direct the fellowship, that I have decision-making ability, that we're going to do X, Y, and Z because that's what we're doing. And so I think for me, and possibly for other women leaders, there are iterations to the microaggressions that misogyny brings. I'm grateful to not be fighting the battles my mother and my sister had to fight, but my battles still take a lot out of me. And they're a little bit harder to name because they're less overt, they're more covert. And so then when you try to defend why you took offense, everyone makes it very particular. Oh, they didn't mean it like that. No, they were just joking. Oh, that you took that to heart, and you can't actually really find a way to self-advocate because the folks have gotten so professional in their misogyny that they know what they can and can't say in order to make sure they don't end up in some sort of legality that they don't want to be in. So that's been my experience. But I will tell you, it is nothing compared to what so many I know have moved through. And for that, I'm really grateful. And I recognize that privilege, and I try to, because of that privilege, open my mouth wherever I get to go about the experiences that others have who perhaps haven't been as fortunate as me yet in their journey.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was really, really powerful. What I'm hearing is this, I'm hearing a lot of things, but one thing that's standing out to me is this focus on the insidious ways that misogyny is still wrapped into our cultural paradigm, and the Christian paradigm particularly, right? Which I think goes back to what Kristin was talking about, the ways that it has been sort of baked in, right? And so even when it's not explicit, there's a way of looking at the world that nevertheless continues to subjugate women, consciously or not. And in that way, that paradigm that we are perpetuating, right, amongst Christian churches often, that paradigm is destructive to all of us, right? As you said, it's exhausting, right? And so our leaders, our women leaders are becoming exhausted, right? And so there's just ripple effects that this paradigm is causing, that I think really identifying that is so helpful to help start moving away from it and sort of checking, where did that assumption come from? Is it one that is valid, right? Is it one that's viewing women as equal, or is it succumbing to this patriarchal paradigm? So thank you for sharing all of that. That was really beautiful. Reverend Terry, I want to pick up on this with you. You are the second woman to lead the Disciples of Christ, first person of color and African descent. Given Kristin's historical framing of the distortion of Christianity for power, given this conversation we've been having about the ways it shows up insidiously, can you tell us about your experience in leadership and what insights you've gained, particularly about what Christian faith is or should be or calls us to?
Yeah, this has just been so rich, and I'm drinking it all in. I am the second woman. Disciples were the first mainline denomination to call a woman to lead them. And to date, while the historically Black denominations have named women to be, say, the president of the College of Bishops, they have not called anyone to be a presiding or senior bishop. And I think that's where I was shocked to learn that. And it was my predecessor, the Reverend Dr. Sharon Watkins, that let me know of my historic place as a Black woman leading a denomination, period. I was actually very shocked to learn that. I grew up in the Black Baptist church. I had a very progressive grandfather, saw women who were able to lead and were able to even stand in the pulpit, heaven forbid. Even for things like Women's Day, there were a lot of Baptist churches where women weren't even allowed to stand in the pulpit. And the Disciples congregation that my family became a member of when I was in college, I watched them ordain the first woman, even though there were many white disciples women who had been ordained till that point. My predecessor's election was seen as this, wow, transformative movement. My election was seen as, well, wow, we can elect a woman twice. And oh my gosh, we're anti-racist now because we've elected a person of color. We have overcome. People will still tell me stories of being very emotional the night of my election and how exciting it was, et cetera. And yet what I have discovered is really a lot of the same gender and race issues that I have found in my corporate career. I'm a second career minister. I didn't go to seminary until my late 30s, was ordained in my early 40s, and worked in higher ed after I was ordained before even pastoring. So I'm used to being, because again, of the age which I came of age, was used to being one of few women and one of few Black people in the information technology space. In corporate spaces, as I was able to attain certain senior executive level positions, was used to kind of being, if not the first, certainly one of the only ones. And so finding, opportunities to find other women or women of color would often be exciting. And it still is, right, in ministry. One of the things that I have been asked often is, what is harder? Is it harder to be a woman in this space, or is it harder to be Black? I can't separate those two. Neither should I, and I need to be able to claim it and cherish both of those aspects of my identity. I will say that because I came from outside the church into the church to lead, my leadership style is very different from most women who have only been clergy. And people tell me this all the time, that I'm more comfortable with the administrative things that are involved in the church. I'm more comfortable with assuming, as Pastor Gabby noted earlier, that I'm leading. and so I'm used to, my executive coach even tells me all the time, you're very comfortable with using authority. Yes, I am. I don't think that's an arrogant thing. That is just what I have had to do to be successful in other spaces. And I think in an environment where people have assumed, because of the institutional culture, that, oh, it's the second woman, she's going to need our help. Oh, the first person of color. There was literally a particular kind of orientation that I received from the denomination with the thought, oh, we have to really be sure we do this right because now we have a person of color who's leading. And I've looked through orientation for some of our middle judicatory leaders. And while the church felt that they were trying to update this kind of information, both for women and people of color, it came across as being very patriarchal and condescending, because the assumption was always that the person who was doing the orienting was going to be a male and a white male at that. So while, is it exciting? Oh, yes, it's exciting to see women all over the place. We now have, when I was elected, not only had Sharon Watkins preceded me, but Bishop Elizabeth Eaton, presiding bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Dr. Betsy Miller was at the time head of the Moravian Church in America. We now have Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, who's the 1 or 2 years into being the general minister and president of the United Church of Christ. The American Baptists have called a Black woman as general secretary. The Presbyterian Church USA have called an Asian woman as their stated clerk. The Unitarian Universalists have called a Hispanic woman to lead them. So there are not only many more women leading, in particularly in these mainline spaces, but most of them are women of color most recently. And we seem to want to pat ourselves on the back on this. What I have learned is that white male patriarchy still values the institutions to which in which they climb the ladder, right? So if you're going to try to shift the systems to perhaps, as we say, we welcome all to the table as God has welcomed us. We declare and have for decades declared ourselves to be an anti-racist church. If we really want to be, I'm always saying the mantra we need to have is, let's be the church we say we are. We don't need snappy slogans or new mission statements. We need to just be, God has told us, Jesus has told us what he believes the church should be living into. We don't need fancy stuff. I've lived through that kind of stuff in the corporate world. We spend a lot of time on consultants framing what we think we're supposed to be about, and we don't do it. We build these things, and I repent of all the years as a consultant where I led people in these strategic IT plans, and they sit in nice binders and you make nice presentations, and people don't do it. We have to do it. And we still live in, because we're in the United States of America, the disciples, the first denomination to really have its roots on the frontier, I don't like those words either, in the prairie, very much that rugged, individualistic kind of understanding. You ain't the boss of me. Nobody, even at the communion table, who are you to tell me that I'm worthy to have communion this week? Get a token and confess to your priest. That was seen as something that one couldn't stand in judgment of another person. Congregations, independent. We didn't want a structure or a hierarchy. And that still is very much part of the institutional culture. But we deny the fact that we built an institution so that some people could exercise power over the things of the church. And we're not very comfortable when women or people of color now sit in the seat where that same power can and should be wielded. I'm not the kind, I express myself very intensely, perhaps. I was told in one meeting, they were mad because you yelled at them. I did not yell. I may have expressed myself very clearly, but I was responding to something, underground conversation, where my position and my person had been disrespected. So yeah, I was a pretty little intense about it, but if a man had said exactly what I said, and perhaps even with the same force with which I had said it, everyone would have sat back and taken notice. And I actually challenged this person in the moment to say, are you trying to use that very outdated and racist trope of the angry Black woman to tell me that I didn't communicate in a way that you thought was appropriate? If I had cried, you would have criticized me for being too emotional. So I can't win no matter which way I go. And what I'm hoping, and we've made a lot of governance changes within the disciples in the last year that we're just now starting to implement. But what I have learned is that people are uncomfortable with women who are comfortable with authority. And I'm not seeking anybody's blessing. I'm not looking for you to pat me on my head and say, oh, you did a good job, Terry. I appreciate the affirmation of colleagues and peers, and I will be the first one when I sit down to say, oh, wow, how did that come across? Not because I don't think I could do it, but because I want to be sure that what I intended was what was received. And I think there are still men in our institutions who think there's somehow a pat on the head that needs to be given or puppet strings that need to be pulled, and that you still, even though the world has changed, that your mission is still, I'm still supposed to be perpetuating the racist patriarchy. And if I forget that the very system that now allows me and asks me to sit in this seat used to prevent me from being in any of these seats, I become complicit. And I see far too many people really taking on the mantle of the oppressor's power instead of trying to dismantle it. And as the old saying goes, you cannot destroy the oppressor's system with the oppressor's tools. We have to do things a different way. So whether it's gender or race, we're not comfortable with women being comfortable with authority. And I think the ways in which Jesus led of inclusion and respect and truth telling, we don't like to be told the truth either. We don't like people who are comfortable with truth telling, and we certainly are not comfortable with women who are not afraid to tell the truth.
Thank you so much. That was so rich. I am struck by your claim that we don't need a slogan, right? We just need to be the church we say we are. And I think that's so powerful, especially, I'm in terms of this conversation, thinking about in Christ, there is no male or female. And yet all of these structures, the white male perspective is normative, right? And so there's a way in which you're inviting us to really shift this paradigm to a perspective of that is Christ-like, right? That is beyond or that transforms those notions of power. So thank you for that. Kristin, I actually want to turn to you to kind of follow up on this. I know that you, in Jesus and John Wayne, you wrote about the ways in which feminine coded virtues were sort of denigrated, right? And Christianity began to affirm masculine coded values and even war and imperialism, all of those things. And so in this recent election, views, we have the recent study from PRRI that shows that views about gender emerged as a really powerful predictor in explaining support for Trump in 2024. And so white working class voters who agree that society as a whole has become too soft and feminine were nearly 5 times as likely as those who disagree to support Donald Trump. And given that the majority of support for Trump came from Christians, 72% of white Christians voted for Trump, what do we make of that? Why is femininity denigrated and also assumed to be not powerful?
I mean, you're absolutely right. It's, if we look at, what is the fruit of the Spirit? I think you opened this session talking about, essentially the fruit that a tree bears, and this is how you will know. And well, what is the fruit of the Spirit? We have it spelled out very clearly for us in Scripture, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. Now, are these things coded feminine? I mean, it all depends, right? There are different cultures, time periods, different constructions of masculinity and femininity. 150, 200 years ago, masculinity was characterized, particularly a certain kind of white middle-class masculinity, characterized in terms of honor and restraint, right? Restraining those impulses. And then you see how that changes over time. So that restraint becomes feminized, and a kind of rugged impulsivity it gets elevated as masculinity. And you can just see so much change over time. So, one of the things I do as a historian when we're talking about things being coded masculine or coded feminine, to recognize that that's always very culturally specific. And yet, in this particular moment, what we see is, if you look again at that list, the fruit of the Spirit, my goodness, those, and then you look at, let's say, Christian nationalist spaces, you will not see any of those attributes, any of those, core Christian virtues celebrated, not even mentioned, right? You're going to hear, calls to aggression, calls to, set aside emotion, calls to, the latest discourse is the sin of empathy, right? So they have to do a lot of theological gymnastics. And these are, quote unquote, Bible believing Christians. These are the people who are talking about the authority of the scriptures and biblical inerrancy and literalism, and all of these things have to get very creative theologically to set aside what we are told very, very clearly the signs of being in Christ are. And when Jesus tells his followers what it is that they are to do. So how do we explain this? How do we understand this? I mean, there's different frameworks, I suppose. I happen to come from a Calvinist background, and we're really big on sin and, the sin of pride and the sin of grasping for power. And so there's a theological framework. There's a temptation here. There's always a temptation to set aside these virtues and to be selfish and to try to elevate yourself above others and at the cost of others. And then the real temptation for Christians is to find a way to do so while calling it righteous. And a way of doing so while telling others that they are to submit to you in doing it and to call you righteous in doing it, right? This is kind of what we're seeing here. And, we really just have to get back to basics as Christians, to look at those scriptures and, and to take them seriously and to hold them up to other quote unquote Bible believing Christians and, and hold them accountable to that. It is really striking to me, and I saw this in my research over the past, more than a decade, just how rarely the popular literature on Christian manhood, Christian masculinity, how rarely they actually look to Jesus, and how rarely the fruit of the Spirit, the Beatitudes, the very clear commands to love your neighbor as yourself, to love your enemy, all of these things, right? These are subversive values. And let me also say that to do these things requires fortitude, requires strength, requires courage. And to work for your own gain, that doesn't require courage. That's just selfishness, right? So I would really push back against some of the common motifs out there and say that, what really takes strength and what is really noble and honorable is not the things that the right is claiming. It's all, it's a facade, and it is at its heart, it's Antichrist.
Thank you. It's so powerful that thinking about the ways what Jesus embodied and calls us to was not this coercive and authoritarian power. And to think about how that has been distorted at the cost of then denigrating the things that now we call feminine, when in fact Christ embodied all of those things, right? So it doesn't make sense except to pull through this thread of the misogyny that's at work here. Pastor Gabby, I want to come to you for a minute. You wrote a beautiful reflection a couple of years ago on a woman, Jeanné Lewis, who lived in the 19th century. She was a contemporary of Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, and she was the first Black woman authorized to preach by Bishop Richard Allen in 1819. But it actually, you write, took 200 years for that same denomination to ordain her posthumously. And so I came across this reflection as I was preparing for today, and it just spoke so powerfully to me of this need for recognizing who we are, recognizing what power means in a Christian way, in a follower of Christ way, and living into that power. And I think, you mentioned that the roots of resilience was something you really wanted to explore. And I think this will hopefully be a way of articulating some of those roots. So 2 lines that really spoke to me from this piece on Jeanné Lewis. You wrote that among these women, I find a similar resilience and determination. They each did what they were purposed to do without permission from those that sought to silence and oppress them. She refused to let those who didn't value her be the ones with the opportunity to tell her story. And then you also wrote that something you learned from her story was to put something aside for yourself, to maintain some way of finding fulfillment for yourself. Put aside some joy, put aside some laughter. And it seems to me that in this moment, when we are struggling under the weight of what is such a heavy and burdensome crisis, that those insights are really powerful and helpful. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Kathleen. And also just Kristin, thank you for that just brilliant unpacking of just obviously your work, but it's just so powerful to hear it laid out so clearly. So thank you for that. Yeah, so I mean, I'm a Baptist ordained minister, but my mother is a retired AME minister. I grew up in the AME church, and I served in AME church I served the church for 5 years, but I was in that church for 10 years. So Jeanné Lewis is an AME woman. She is a woman who was the first woman licensed to preach in the AME church. AME is African Methodist Episcopal. Here's what's interesting about Jeanné Lewis' social location in this whole story. The African Methodist Episcopal Church is founded by Richard Allen and a couple of others who were in the back of a predominantly white or an all-white Methodist church trying to pray. And they were told they couldn't pray there because they were Black men. They leave this church and launch the AME denomination ultimately. First, the Free African Society, it becomes the African American, it becomes the AME denomination, so that Black folks, many of them who were newly freed individuals, formerly enslaved, could have somewhere to worship freely. So here's the kind of freedom of folks by race, right? To Terry's point about why we can't separate race and gender, here comes a Black woman who says, I've been called to preach. I'm real clear about my call, the same way y'all are clear about my call. And she has to continually make her case to Richard Allen for her papers to preach, right? She goes up and down the nation preaching anyway. And even though the denomination pats themselves on the back about her being the first one licensed, it takes her a long time between when she advocates for herself that she should be licensed to when she's actually licensed by Richard Allen. So much so that the story goes that there is a moment where a Black male preacher is preaching and just, floundering. And Jeanné Lewis, as the story goes, stands up and finishes this person's sermon. She was unapologetic, courageous, preached anyhow, did not have the support of her denomination for a very long time. And yes, it took almost 200 years for the AME church to say, you know what, let's go ahead and just ordain her, right? This matters because we talk about misogyny, as we talk about what it means to understand our own social locations. There are, compounding areas of marginalization that women experience. And Jeanné Lewis is an example of a woman for me. When I wrote that piece, I just spent some more time with her. I always knew her story, but I spent some more time with her because I was in a webinar with Dr. Teresa Brown, who is the general historian, the national historian of the AME Church. And she was going through the archives and the records and bringing up data. And so it made the story even more real to me, and not so much a fairy tale, but like an actual historic account of someone who lived in a similar time period as these heroes of our denomination. And still there was this misogyny wrapped up in why she couldn't do what she was called to do. And so what I wrote about was how it reminded me that if we wait to be approved, or if we wait to be celebrated, to do our work in the world as women, we're going to be waiting a long time. Our lives may pass us before we can have that impact. But what stood out to me just now, Kathleen, is when you gave the statistic that 72% of white Christians voted for Trump. When you gave that stat, the only stat I could hear in my head was the 92% of Black women who voted for Kamala Harris. The polarization of those two numbers is baffling to me, because so many Black women are also Christians. So the idea that there is such a disconnect between what 92% of Black women did at the ballot box, who are also Christian, and what 72% of white Christians did, that chasm, I think, is such a great example of why resilience is so necessary as we look at our own social locations, marginalizations, and intersectionality. Because the stats help us to see there's a disconnect here between what is happening based on race, gender, sexuality, and any other area of marginalization that is causing various groups who all believe in God to have these drastically different experiences. And the threat is for the experiences that are not white evangelical to be silenced and to be siphoned off as not normative. And we're in a moment right now where every time I say I'm a pastor, I got to explain what that means when I'm talking to people, because I do ministry in New York where everybody's not going to church every day, right? Every Sunday, right? In the South, everybody goes to church in the South. So I may have a gender issue in the South, but I don't have a faith issue in the South. Everybody believes something, most of them. Up here, they don't care about my gender because they're not going to church anyway. It's not how they move. It's not, for the majority of New Yorkers, Sunday morning is a slow morning with their newspaper, going to the gym, walking their dog, going to brunch, relaxing. It is not, even if they are a Christian, maybe they turn on YouTube and watch a sermon. And so what I would say to kind of thread these moments is that I think the Jeanné Lewis moment for me is a reminder that you can be a sub-marginalized group of an already marginalized population. And many times women, and in particular women of color, find themselves in that vein. And so the kind of tucking away for yourself and doing what you're called to anyway is just a reminder to all that misogyny, patriarchy, it's going to always try to silence you. It's going to always try to cause you to justify why you deserve the same thing that you just stood alongside the men to fight for, why they deserve what they deserve. And so many women march and lock arms with men, fight for their freedom, and then turn around and expect the same alliance and don't receive it. So that's the Jeanné Lewis moment. But on the 92%, 72% chasm, right? I think it's something we can't ignore, right? That as much as I don't have the data on how many Black women identify as Christian, but I know it's high. And for there to be such a huge disconnect between what that faith tradition calls them to do politically and what the faith tradition that Kristin so eloquently kind of narrated for us calls a particular demographic of folks to do. The chasm between that, I mean, it takes a lot of resilience to still show up at church and to still show up in other spaces and to still engage in necessary dialogue to highlight that there's a gap between what some folks believe, Christ intends for us and what others do. And we all got to live in the same world together with the same label of Christian, which makes it very, very difficult to make it from day to day. So then that's what I would offer.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I love that insight about still showing up, right? Making sure to still be speaking and not allow yourself to be silenced. I think that's so important, something we can all sort of hold on to. I also think, as you're talking about this chasm between 72% of white Christians voting for Trump, 92% of Black women voting for Harris, there's something there perhaps that is rooted in fear. Right. And so, Jeanné, I want to turn to you because I know that you've talked about this a little bit. And we'll turn to audience questions after this one. So be thinking of your questions and putting them in the Q&A, please. But in an interview on the podcast, The State of Belief, Jeanné, you said, when we listen to leaders like Dr. King and John Lewis and other folks who came before us, we see very much that engaging people's fear with compassion while still speaking the truth about another vision and what needs to happen can be very transformative. So I would love to hear from you. What are some of the fears that you've seen show up in your work as you do your faith in public life? And also, what vision do you want to invite people toward?
Yeah. I think that the overarching fear that we see is a fear of losing identity. So the rhetoric that we hear that is racist, that is sexist, that is xenophobic, this effective strategy of authoritarians to vilify some other, and it doesn't really matter who the other is, the other often changes. It's meant to tap into a very deep and primal fear of losing our identity. So because America has such a legacy of oppression and has cultivated a sense of belonging and identity that is dependent on hierarchy, it is very hard for people to relinquish that myth and imagine a country that is equally inclusive of others. I also think that beyond the narrative of America, we each have navigated family dynamics, the legacy of our own identity markers, and also our Christianity that often presents a binary. So it's us or them, you're in or you're out, you must choose. And so all of this is very deep psychologically, it is very primal. So that leads to fears about our safety. It leads to fears about our own sense of belonging, our own sense of security. So the invitation is to expand and reimagine our identities as children of God, particularly for Christians, because there's already ostensibly a foundation there that says that we are children of God. Most other religions as well have some sort of principle of belonging to God, being connected to God. And so if we can elevate that as the fundamental identity, that is much stronger. It is much harder to shake that identity than it is around any other marker, our race, our age, our gender, our nationality, our ethnicity, our family, the state that we live in, et cetera. It's not dependent on a political party or our physical bodies. But I think oftentimes people assert this identity, this fundamental identity as a child of God in order to flatten the rest of our identities. And I think that is a huge misstep as well, because God created a diverse universe and we are also diverse. And we can see from the collective wisdom of humanity that the unique physical bodies or the unique experiences that we hold as Black people, as women, as people born in this century or last century in this country, that gives us a unique perspective and wisdom to elevate the whole of humanity to the kingdom of God. The analysis, the shared experiences, and the wisdom that can be gleaned from that in this time, in this place, with this configuration of humanity is distinct and unique from what it was 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And so there's also a spiritual opportunity in that, and we can't deny these other identity markers. But if we can fundamentally rely on our identities as children of God, it creates more stability that makes some of the other change we're experiencing and that naturally causes fear to be less impactful. You're on mute, Kathleen.
Sorry, thank you so much. I love that image of the flattening of your identity as a child of God, right? Whereas Christ came that we may have life abundantly. And so claiming your identity as a child of God should open you up and expand, give you a new perspective and a new paradigm, right? Rather than flattening. Thank you so much for that. I love that image. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn and look for some questions from the audience. And to start, this one can be for anyone. This is from Kathleen Whitmire. She asks, what actions can we take to start to dismantle the patriarchal hierarchy and Christian nationalism? In 2 minutes, go. Anyone can jump in for that one.
You know, we've had lots of conversations, right? Ever since even before the election about this. We've been in rooms lamenting and wringing our hands. And I think what I'm noticing is that even the courts, Congress are falling short in terms of the courage. And I really do think it's going to require, you know, Dr. King always used to say, it's not necessarily bad people or evil people, their actions that's the problem. It's when good people are good, and I use those quotes, are silent. And so people who really do disagree with what's going on in terms of Christian nationalism tend to be silent, in large part because we think it's not the role of Christians to engage. We don't think we have a right even to critique our own government or critique the empire. Prophets have always critiqued the empire. And I think we've got to decide whether or not this is really what we believe, if the way of Jesus is really what we believe and really what we want to do, and just do that. And I think if enough of us will join together, and I know there are lots of tables where people are trying to coalesce around strategies and sharing of resources to do just that, but statements and treatises and convening tables have their role, but we've really got to motivate people to literally get out there and resist in all the ways in which we can resist, whether it's streets in front of the Supreme Court, or whether it's just getting more people to vote than say, when we're one of the suburbs of Chicago, they were excited about a 26% turnout during the primaries. That's ridiculous. In the elections in 2008 and in 2012, when Barack Obama was running here in the Chicago area, you waited in line for hours and hours and hours. You waited in line during early voting, and people were excited. We have to treat every election, I don't care if it's just for dog catcher, like Barack Obama, like it's that important, and that you understand your power. We understood our power, some of us. Hillary, when she was running, and even with Kamala, women, and even naming the dichotomy and the paradox that Pastor Gabby named, we thought that white women were going to be with Kamala enough. And there's been a great deal of disappointment raised that we still see high percentages of white women still voted for Trump and not Kamala. So in that case, it didn't seem to be enough that she was a woman, whereas there was a great energy around Hillary. But the point is, we have power to choose, and we have to take that power. The power needs to come from the bottom up and not just from the top down. And people in our churches have to quit being afraid to talk about these things, regardless of our race or gender. We're too afraid to preach on it in pulpits. I, as a person who came out of the Black church, I know that that's not the case in most of the Black church, although some, we're not monolithic at all. There are some places where people, the same people who didn't like Dr. King because they thought he was causing trouble, there are still those out there, people of color, who think, stay out of that. But we have to be, I know in my own tradition, we don't need to be talking about that. You're spending too much time on justice and not enough on evangelism. For me, evangelism is justice is evangelism. How can I invite you to know Jesus unless I help you understand what Jesus cares about? and what he's about. If I care that you eat and have all the things that you need to flourish, I want you to know that that's Jesus. And perhaps people are not seeing that that's Jesus. And when people see us standing for them and fighting for them across race, across gender, across economic and socioeconomic class lines, then that for me is evangelism. But I think the church has to not be afraid to do that work and see it as one of the most powerful forms of evangelism.
Thank you. So have the courage to start, right? And who knows what the outcome will be, but we're called to do our part. Yeah. Thank you for that. Does anyone else want to add before I move to another question? Okay. Let's see. Here's a question from Kevin Wilson, who says, as a white cisgender male who's exhausted with white nationalism, and particularly white male nationalism and mansplaining, how do I support and use my position of privilege to support and empower? Anyone can jump in.
I can offer some thoughts. I heard Bernice Johnson Reagan, who civil rights leader, founder of Sweet Honey in the Rock, speak once on a panel, and a young person asked, how do I do what you did? And she said, you shouldn't do what I did. You should do what you are called to do. I did what I did because it was appropriate for the time and the place where I was. You are here now. Do what is appropriate and what you are called to do now. And I think we are in a moment where each of us is hearing that call more strongly than we ever have before. I am not a white man. I am not privy most often to the full thoughts of white men who ascribe to white Christian nationalism. Sometimes I hear that, but not usually. And so I think there's an opportunity for you to discern in real time how you are speaking to your peers about their worldview, also with your own. And a lot of what we've shared today around holding the paradox, juxtaposing truth with compassion, real listening to what might be underlying fears or concerns from people who hold this point of view, coupled with a clear and unapologetic assertion of where it might fall short and an alternative reality that they can believe in. There's no silver bullet to that. But I think there's a commitment, particularly as you're speaking with your peers, and you may share points of resonance that I certainly don't, or that others may not. There's opportunities there for you to leverage that. And I would also say, from a spiritual and Christian perspective, pray about it. From our Christianity, we understand that the Holy Spirit will intervene and will elevate and maximize the impact of our actions when we may not fully understand what to do. I think this is a time for us as Christians, particularly, to lean into that reality of our faith while offering courage and speaking truth with love and compassion.
I'll just jump in very quickly too, because amen to everything Jeanné just said. Pray and figure out where you are and what it is that you particularly can do, but do not underestimate the power that you have to have somebody else's back. That many of us are out there taking some pretty big risks, and the risks grow by the hour. And I know when Jesus and John Wayne came out, there were a lot of conservative white pastor types who were trying to tear it down. And then there were a few conservative white pastor types who had my back. I did not expect them to, and it made so much of a difference. They had integrity, and they did not agree with me on all things, and they did not need to still speak up and hold their people accountable and to defend what was true. And that, again, just don't underestimate wherever you are placed. You may be placed in that position to have great power, to create space for others and to open space in your communities for other voices, and simply to have somebody's back. For those of us, again, who are out there kind of on the front lines right now, we feel vulnerable at times, and to know that people are supporting us, speaking out on behalf of us, are ready to put a little skin in the game along with us, makes an enormous difference. So look for ways that you could do that.
And if I could just jump in, I would say yes to what Jeanné and Kristin said. I would also offer that sometimes what women say is not heard by a particular kind of man because it's been said by a woman. So you could start by just repeating what you've heard women say that you trust and saying it in closed door rooms with men. And it might be interesting. Oh, I haven't thought about it that way. Oh, I haven't heard it in that way. It could have been exactly verbatim what a woman said the day before, but they couldn't hear it or they were more defensive because a woman said it. And then you can backdoor say, yeah, you know, Jeanné said that yesterday in the meeting, but but wait to give us attribution until the point is made. But that's a really low entryway for you to echo and support our words in spaces and places where they need to be heard, where sometimes our personhood just blocks people's capacity to hear us.
Thank you so much, all of you. Here's a question from Leandra Schuler. As a mother of a little girl, where do you see inspiration for me to guide her? And I would love to invite you all to talk about, as we've been talking about the roots of resilience, maybe share your favorite figure, ancestor that you hold on to in this moment. Anyone can jump in.
I'll start again. I've mentioned my grandmother, certainly, but most people don't know her. Someone else who is deep on my heart is Wilma Mankiller. Wilma Mankiller was the first female modern day chief of the Cherokee Nation. And she was a powerful organizer. She was an activist. She was a politician. She was a teacher. But what I honor about her, again, she had a very feminine style of leadership. She was trained as a lawyer and an activist. She had a bad car accident, near-death experience. And in processing that experience, really resolved to serve her community in a different way. And so her nation was facing deep challenges. This is 20th century, deep challenges, infrastructure, poverty, and she went door to door, house to house, very personal, relational, in order to understand the needs and the experiences of the people, and drew from those relationships an opportunity to weave them together to be self-determined while still demanding what was due to them from the federal government. The story of her life, I think, is just a beautiful illustration of what it means to integrate different manifestations of empowerment, self-determination, compassion, love, justice. And I have a picture of her on my wall in my office at home because she inspires me to really grow in my leadership in that way.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful.
I was, again, I'm a woman of a certain age, and I was in junior high during the whole Watergate debacle. And I was totally mesmerized by Barbara Jordan, Congresswoman from Texas, in a very male space, very white space. She was a tall woman. She wasn't a small, petite woman, but she had this voice and a command of the language. She was a brilliant legal mind. I think that the law school at the University of Texas is now named after her. But that, for me, was the first public witness beyond the women in my own family who, you know, my paternal grandmother was like the first Black woman to be a librarian. She was a reference librarian in our county. My maternal grandmother descended from a free settlement of Blacks who came to Indiana before the Civil War, and she led the move to start a community club and buy some land because places for children to play were segregated. So beyond my own family, I would have to name Barbara Jordan because she was in those very public spaces where people weren't taking women seriously, and they certainly weren't taking Black people seriously. And she stood them all. Her early death is certainly, I think, a great loss, not only to the nation and to little girls everywhere. And then I think of Shirley Chisholm before there was Kamala. There was Shirley Chisholm, who even dared, and nobody took her seriously, even dared to believe that not only could she do it, but she did it anyway. She proceeded anyway. And it's that kind of courage together with resilience. Shirley didn't disappear from the scene. And who knows the challenges that Barbara Jordan had to overcome. But Barbara Jordan and Shirley, as a little girl, were women who I saw in the public, who I said, I want to do that. I want to have that kind of impact on the world.
Thank you so much.
I'll hop in. So I'm gonna give a living person because she mentioned her little girl. And so I'm thinking about little girls and who they can see. And you know, before I was a pastor, I was in entertainment. So I have to speak the name Issa Rae. Okay. She's not a political figure, but I think she is a wonderful role model. Her first round of production was literally called Awkward Black Girl, where she worked her way through her own awkwardness and her own understanding and really became an actor because she couldn't find any actors to act in her things, and she wanted to make sure it was done a particular way, and has now built out a media empire where she's telling the stories that she knows needs to be told. And I think about her because at the top of the year, when Donald Trump announced himself as the chairman of the Kennedy Center, Issa Rae had a sold out show that was supposed to occur maybe a week later. And she made a public statement. I think she was one of the first to say, this show is now canceled. You will all receive refunds because of the change in leadership. And to me, that was such a major statement, not by a politician, but by an entertainer. Someone who is here to entertain, but also is very clear about her position and her power, and who's telling her own stories. So for the little girl, I'll give you Issa Rae. For the ancestor whose name I must speak in this room, I went from AME to Baptist, so I got to give you Prathia Hall, who was a Baptist woman preacher, who the very words, I have a dream, from the I have a dream speech, were first uttered by Prathia Hall. Martin Luther King Jr. overhears it at a rally in the Midwest, asks her permission, she gives it, and then he uses those words in his iconic speech that we all know so well. And of course, just beyond that, she's a prolific thinker, writer, pastor, preacher in a time where the Baptist Church was not kind to Black women clergy. She also died earlier than she should have, just after finishing her PhD at Princeton. But I speak her name in the room.
Thank you so much.
And I'll just
Kristin.
add briefly, as a historian, there are so many women that I have learned about in history, Christian history, and also, many of us are going to the civil rights era, and rightly so. I mean, Fannie Lou Hamer is just an incredible model for me, even though, it's incredibly different life, but her courage and her resilience, I draw on almost daily now, thinking about, when I feel afraid, when I feel overwhelmed, I'm like, wait a minute, let me just look at Fannie Lou Hamer. But also, yes, thinking about a little girl, when I teach college students and I ask them, kind of like, what's your model for manhood or for femininity or things like this? Do you know what like 90% say? A parent. A parent. So you are your child's greatest role model. And maybe that means that you need to draw deep, or maybe you haven't had those kind of role models. For me, I will say, when I first moved out into this kind of public space, which happened somewhat inadvertently, but I found myself moving more and more into the public, I realized I had to make a choice, because every instinct of mine was not to do it. Every instinct was to apologize for what I was doing, for pulling back. But I knew I needed to get this stuff out there. And I knew that there was a way that white Christian women were supposed to do it in the circles that I moved, in the circles I grew up, which was with a lot of apologies, always. So I wrote a thing, and, just like always, like taking that power away, even as you're trying to put something out there. And I at least had the framework to see it, to recognize this impulse that was always pulling at me, and feeling like, oh, I'm too proud. Oh, I'm too, no, I just actually want people to read this stuff. I think it's important. I think it could change people's lives. But feeling like it wasn't my right to do that, or feeling like I would be judged for doing it, as I would be. And I just decided to recognize that and ignore it, set it aside. And I promised to myself that I would not apologize for what I was doing. I would simply say what I had to say and not bracket it and not try to diminish myself. I was just going to say it. And my goodness, it was hard. Again, when I started, all of my impulses were pulling me in the other direction. And then it just got easier. But every once in a while, I still have to like push through that. And what I realized is that it made a huge difference. And I started hearing from other women, especially white Christian women, saying, how are you doing this? How are you doing what you're doing? And help me to do this too. And honestly, it was just a recognition and then a deliberate choice to push back against all those things holding me back and to just go out and say what I thought needed to be said. And what I realized is just how rare that is in many spaces. So for each of you out there, you know, whatever position you find yourself in, whatever your, you know, your community has taught you, or whatever your even faith tradition has told you you can or can't do, take a look at that and then decide if you want to follow those rules, or decide if maybe you need to follow another set of rules.
Thank you so much. I think that is actually a perfect place to wrap up. So we hope you will all take this and move forward in resilience, in your own capacity, in your own role, whatever that is, whatever God has called you to in this moment. I hope that you will all join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you so much. This has been so rich and so wonderful. We so appreciate your time. And also, I just want to encourage our audience members to please make sure to register for our upcoming events. There's another Women in Leadership series coming up, series event coming up on Tuesday, the 25th, called Resistance and Resilience. It's featuring Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan from Minnesota, as well as some others, and that will look at these questions from the lens of public life and political figures. There's also a series of workshops starting tomorrow called Fasting for Justice, where we'll dig into tools that you can take forward into your own communities on community organizing, political advocacy, nonviolence, and others. So we hope that you'll join those. My colleague Jim Simpson is posting the links for those in the chat right now, and they'll also be in the follow-up email that we send to you. Okay, and with that, we will wrap up. So thank you again, and thank you all to all of you for joining us, and be well.